Welcome to We Got Goals, a podcast by asweatlife.com. I'm Kristen Guile, the Chief Content Officer, and today, as part of our deep dive into the history of fitness, I am talking with Danielle Friedman. Danielle is the author of the book Let's Get Physical: How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World. And she's also an award-winning journalist whose feature writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Cut, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Glamour, Health, and many other publications. Danielle, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, we're excited. I just finished reading your book last week. Everyone has to comment on the cover because it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Thank you.
And it was such a fun read. And you really did a great job of sort of taking the history of women's exercise through the decades, highlighting the heroes beyond Jane Fonda, who I think was the only person that I would have really thought about before going into the depths of your book. But I'd love to start at the beginning and hear a little bit about how you started thinking about the history of women's exercise. I know that your article for The Cut really sort of helped pave the way and sort of spark that interest. So tell me your origin story.
Yeah, sure. So the book began 5 years ago when I was actually getting ready for my wedding. I'm always a little bit sheepish to say that, but I was getting ready for my wedding and I decided to venture into my first boutique fitness studio. I'm a lifelong runner, but I'd never really done boutique fitness. And so I decided to take some bar classes. While I was there, I loved how strong the classes made me feel. I also, as a women's health journalist and a feminist journalist, was intrigued by the fact that many of the moves in class felt very sexual in nature. And it was something that was sort of funny to me because no one was like acknowledging it during class.
Yeah. Anytime you hear someone say tuck, it's the hardest thing to describe. But I remember my first bar class probably around the same time you took yours. And I was like, what the heck do they mean? What is tucking? Am I just supposed to like squeeze my butt? But yeah. And then once you get sort of into the nuance of it, you're like, oh, what are we doing in here?
Exactly. Yes, there's a whole like secret language of bar classes that it takes a minute to kind of decode. So at the time in particular, I was doing a lot of reporting on sexual health, and I wondered, I was like, are bar classes actually benefiting women's sexual health? And so I started looking into it, and that simple question led me to this much richer, more complicated origin story of Lottie Burke, the woman who invented bar in the late 1950s, who was herself, I describe her as a free love revolutionary. She was very much ahead of her time in that she spoke very openly about sex and sexual desire. And one of the reasons she created her workout was to encourage women to or to help women have better sex lives and to encourage them to kind of embrace their physicality and sexuality. So I was blown away by that story. I couldn't believe that it wasn't more widely known. I wrote about it for The Cut. And I was, the story went viral. And I was amazed to find that even a lot of bar instructors were unfamiliar with the origin story. While I was reporting that story, I also, at one point, I thought, it would be great to talk to the person who wrote like the definitive history of women's fitness. And I was really shocked to discover that that book did not exist. I'm a former book editor. I started my career as a book editor, and I'd always been sort of on the lookout, for ideas that I felt passionately enough about and where there was enough to say about to go deep and maybe explore at book length. And it was at that moment that the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. And for me, it brought together kind of everything I'd been doing in my career up to that point, as well as my personal interest in fitness and women's health and many of the things I care about.
Yeah, there is so much to say on this topic. And for me personally, when I moved to Chicago in 2011, and that was right about the time where like boutique group fitness classes were starting to be a thing. And that's something that we've really I don't know if capitalized on is the right word here to Sweat Life, but like that's how I made many of my best friends. That's how I met my boss. That's how like I've formed a lot of those relationships today. And I just think there's so much to say both about the business of women's place in fitness, the marketing that has been done to sell these classes, and how that you did a great job highlighting how that changed over time. And I really feel like we're going to see a lot of like scholarship in this area going forward, because there's a lot of rich text, if you will.
Yes. I feel like I just sort of scratched the surface in my book.
For readers who maybe haven't picked up your book yet, talk us through sort of the decade. I feel like you sort of organized by decades. You went through a pretty linear timeline. Sort of talk us through like a very brief history, starting with our girl Bonnie.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to say at the outset that was a major goal of mine, to basically show how everything was connected in the history of fitness. And, because I think until now that it's been, and I write this in the introduction, but women's fitness especially has kind of been treated as like a collection of disparate, fads and crazes. And in telling this larger story of women's empowerment, and then also, and I'll get into this, but the sort of both the liberation and the oppression that can exist within, and that has existed within parts of fitness culture. I wanted to show how it was all connected. So with that in mind, the book begins in the 1950s, which was a period, it was the post-World War II era. And it was a time of very strict gender norms, when men were supposed to act like men and women were supposed to act like women. And masculinity was really associated with strength, and femininity with weakness to a large extent, with women were encouraged by magazines to ask their man to help them open the pickle jar, and they were encouraged to lose to men in games. And on top of all of that, Americans were embracing what they called the modern way of life, which was a life of increased comfort and leisure and convenience. People were driving more and sitting more at work and in front of the TV, and using their bodies really less than ever before. So Bonnie Pruden recognized this and thought it was a travesty. And she was all of the figures I write about are kind of larger than life in their own way. But she set out on a mission to try to get America moving. She did a lot of work with kids, but she also focused on women. She wrote a best-selling book called How to Keep Slender and Fit After 30, which
to her audience at the time.
Yes. As you can see, this history is so rich. I have to be careful because I could talk about Bonnie for an hour. So
yes. Well, and she keeps making appearances throughout your book too. Like there's a lot of callbacks to her. So, and she was someone that I had never heard of. And I think of myself as pretty in the know for fitness. Yeah.
She really was a forgotten pioneer. And when she is mentioned in historical texts, it has been as more of a footnote, as opposed to like a real life woman and trailblazer. And so I really wanted to kind of bring her to life for readers. She was very savvy, though, in that she recognized, as many of her contemporaries did at that time, that it would never have worked to just sell strength for strength's sake to women. That idea was a little bit too threatening at that time. And so she encouraged women to do push-ups and to develop muscle, which was pretty radical, but she packaged it as like a little bit of a beauty tool, which made it acceptable, for in a society that was very wary of women's strength. One of her catchphrases, she had all sorts of like Bonnieisms, and it was under every curve there's a muscle, no curve, which is like partly partly true. Anyhow, okay, and if you think of all of the figures as sort of women who are passing the baton to each other, with each decade, we move from the 50s and 60s into the heart of the swinging 60s in London. And that's where Lottie Burke really comes in when she rose to fame with what became the bar workout. And like I mentioned, this, it was perfect timing with the sexual revolution and the rise of the mini skirt, which
Mhm.
sent women to studios to want to shape their figures. And it was also Lottie Studio was really significant because it was group fitness in the way that we think of it today, which was very rare at that time. From the 60s, we move into the 1970s and the feminist movement. I kind of bring us back to the United States in that era. And the 70s, there was just like a confluence of fitness booms. I
Mhm.
look at the rise of women's running, and in particular, Catherine Switzer and
Mhm.
um, the barriers she was up against. 1969 is when aerobic dancing and jazzercise was invented. There were actually
Yeah.
two different programs. They were both invented then, and then it
Jazzercise
became,
trademarked. Yes.
yes, exactly. It became, yes. And it became, that's what became known as just aerobics as
Mhm.
we moved into the 80s.
Mhm.
By the end of the 70s, women's strength training and some of the first women's bodybuilding competitions began to gain some traction. Heading into the 80s, we saw Jane Fonda and the rise of the home workout, the
Mhm.
VHS, which became just a booming industry, the home fitness industry by the end of that decade. From there, I look at, even though the rise of women's strength training began late 70s, it was in the early 90s when we saw like abs of steel, buns of steel, these, this push for hard bodies, really.
Yeah.
So I interviewed Tammy Lee Webb, the star of Buns of Steel. After that, it was the rise of yoga, which I argue in the book and others have pointed out as well, was sort of is widely seen as kind of like a reaction, almost like a backlash to that feel the burn, hard body mentality of the 80s and 90s. Yoga was sort of the perfect thing at the time for people who felt burnt out and just wanted a gentler form of exercise. And then we get much closer to, the present day and the rise of boutique fitness and luxury gyms. And I could keep going, but we're getting
No.
we're inching closer to
Well, it's,
2022.
I know, and I don't want you to summarize your entire book too in depth because I want people to buy it. But that was perfect. Thank you. One of the things I was wondering as you were going through all of those, obviously your book focuses on women, and that's what we are selfishly pretty interested in. Our audience is
Mhm,
mostly
mhm.
millennial women, a lot in urban areas who have this access to fitness as sort of a leisure and social activity. How were men developing in fitness around this
Mm.
time too? Were they, in my head, I can kind of make a case for like, well, they were doing some of the same things. They were doing the running and the bodybuilding, but I feel like you don't really hear a lot about the trends that, were happening in like small communities or um, the marketing messages that they were responding to. It seems like men maybe didn't have like as diverse of fitness activities as like the
Mm.
women's sphere seems as
Mm.
what you go over in your book.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's been a major evolution, of course, in men's fitness as well. The period when my book begins in the 50s, as I was alluding to, it was sort of equally unusual for men to
Mhm.
work out in a regular way. Um, there were actually a lot of stigmas against male bodybuilders.
Yeah.
There was this idea that brain and brawn were incompatible. So
Mhm.
like men who worked on their muscles were thought to be kind of like,
I'm reading about that right now in Bill Hayes's book Sweat. He's talking about how like
yeah,
the ancient Greeks really thought there was like you got
limited.
dumber the bigger you
Yes.
got.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you think if you look at like pop culture and films from mid tree, like the kind of henchmen thugs are the ones with the big,
Yes. Yes.
the big muscles. And so and there was also, our culture was really deeply homophobic at that time too. And so there was this belief that if a man spent like whatever was considered too much time shaping his body,
Mhm.
that his sexual orientation was questioned. And so men tried to avoid drawing that kind of attention to themselves. Gyms were also, not for the most part the way we think of them today. They were often kind of these like dark, dank
Yeah.
places, or they the linking of fitness and luxury would happen a bit later. There was a very popular chain that eventually went bankrupt in the 60s called Vic Tanny's that he was a predecessor of making fitness luxurious. But yeah, for men, there was the rise of fitness also was much more focused on health. In the 1960s, especially, the country was experiencing this cardiac crisis that at the time people thought affected, people thought men's hearts were more vulnerable than women's. And so running and swimming and cardio-based exercise was seen as a corrective for that, potential antidote and corrective for that. It wasn't really until and I am skipping over a little bit here because I could this is
for sure.
but one thing I found fascinating was just the role that Arnold Schwarzenegger played
Yeah.
in
He shows up
normalizing.
in as like really supportive of the female bodybuilders
Yes,
that
yeah,
you highlight. Lisa, right?
Lisa
Lisa.
Lyon, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
They talk about him like training with her and go
yes.
in on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I was going to say, even for men, because he was this, like, he had so much personality, there's this really popular documentary called Pumping Iron that he
Mm-hmm.
is like one of the stars of, along with Lou Ferrigno, and he made muscle aspirational for men. And then he was, I mean, it's there are some complexities to it, but for women as well. So yeah, Lisa Lyon, who also is someone who I think has been really forgotten by history and is a very fascinating personality figure. Um, she was she won one of the first women's only bodybuilding competitions, and like by today's standards, she's, for bodybuilders, she's teeny tiny.
Pete, she was
Yeah,
in the pictures in your book. She's like, I would see her on the street and think nothing of it,
nothing. Yeah, yeah. And this was, I think it was 78, 79 that she won her first edition, which is really around the time when these competitions were starting. And she really saw herself as kind of like a performance artist.
Yeah.
She worked out at Gold's Gym. She was a Beverly Hills native, went to UCLA, worked out at Gold's Gym, and that's where she met Schwarzenegger, and wowed by her. She was also, very beautiful and just very charismatic. And he encouraged her, and he helped. I think she was. He helped her like be a guest poser at some men's competitions, and she became, even though she shied away from considering herself, she did not consider herself a feminist in the way it was defined at the time, and she didn't even consider herself an activist. However, for many years, she crusaded for women's muscle and for the idea that muscle and femininity were not mutually exclusive. And so she helped, as with many of the pioneers in my book, she helped to make muscle and strength feel palatable, acceptable at a time when all muscle, but especially on women, was still considered kind of freakish.
Yeah. And that's something that you return to a lot during your book, is sort of the conflicting marketing messages that women are forced to reckon with
Yes.
through the ages. Working out to get smaller. This is how you get beautiful. And it was almost shocking to hear, like, to read through some of the marketing copy that you included in your book, that, Jazzercise included, or, Jane Fonda, a lot of them talked about, to get your motivation to where you want to be, stand naked in front of the mirror and like pick yourself apart. What was it like for you, like reading those, but then still reckoning that with like the impact that, it was a means to an end for like a good goal to get women more into active activities?
Yeah, I mean, you've sort of pinpointed the biggest challenge of the book for me, which was, chronicling the I set out, believing there was and is a very important feminist story here, because I know from personal experience and from the women in my life, and as a women's health reporter, all of the many ways, including when it comes to mental health and emotional health and social communities, the rise of fitness has benefited women. But of course, it's not that simple. There are these other complexities. And I really wanted to I was curious to see how beauty culture and fitness became so, intertwined. Um, and one of my goals was really by increasing awareness about the way that they've been intertwined historically, was to allow women to harness the really positive, empowering parts of fitness and not have to suffer, the feelings of guilt and shame and other more negative things that historically have come along with it. Um, so yeah, when I was reading those sections, and you'd be amazed. I mean, that exercise, no pun intended, of stripping yourself down in front of the mirror and assessing your flaws, or of like wearing skin tight clothing so you can better be aware of your, so-called flaws, was really consistent. I mean,
Yeah.
I saw that across many decades.
Yeah.
I mean, it was always like a little bit, I mean, to today's ears, it's so shocking.
Yeah.
I couldn't help
Yeah.
but laugh, but it also, even doing the work that I do and everything, it made me feel a little self-conscious just reading
Mhm.
it now. And
Yeah.
as I was thinking about, I sort of felt like I was spending time with each of these pioneers, and I was thinking, well, gosh, like, what would they think? What would they think if if
Yeah.
we were working out together? Um, I think in the early days, some of that was to just, um, the idea that exercise was a tool to shape your body, just period, was still new. Um, Dieting, diet pills, restricting diet culture was a major force in the 1950s and 60s, but
Mhm.
exercising for weight loss was not yet, had not yet caught on in a major way.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that was like these pioneers, or these early figures, using whatever motivational tactics they felt would work. And unfortunately, a lot, that mentality though got really deeply ingrained, in the culture, and became the primary motivator for many, many years. Um,
And you kind
yeah.
of close your book with, the chapter expansion, which is so
Mhm.
delightful. And you feature, a couple of the advocates that we're familiar with and have talked with too on A Sweat
Mm.
Life, Jessamine Stanley and Sadie from 305 Fitness. So it seems like, we're just now in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, starting to
Mhm.
recognize those messages and how they were damaging to, the evolution of women's relationship with exercise and fitness. And we're just now starting to address it. So what was it like having that? I mean, that's like such a nice coda at the end of your book,
Mm. Mm.
and having an optimistic outlook on that.
Thank you. Well, yeah, it was very meaningful to me that the first chapter of the book is titled, Reduce, and the last chapter, like you said, is
Mhm.
titled Expand. And I loved how, just thinking about it that way, helped me in thinking about all of the ways that our understanding of fitness is expanding, our understanding of what a fit body looks like, of who deserves access, who fitness is for,
Mhm.
um, and just what, even just the definition of what fitness means. Um, so it's interesting, actually, when right before I started writing this book, I wrote a piece for one of the media magazines called Forge about the power of women taking up space,
Mhm.
and how, and that it was sort of, um, wonderful to know that I was working toward that, throughout the
Yeah.
whole book
Yep.
process. Um, but yeah, like you said, in the last 5-10 years, while it's very, very early days, I think we really have started to see a shift in the way that fitness professionals are talking um, about bodies and about goals and just about the benefits of exercise. I think the language, especially around that's being used, has changed. You know, most many instructors and studio owners sort of have stopped referring to physical transformation completely.
No more like
Um,
burning off your dinner, like your
ugh,
cheat weekend. And that's something
exactly.
that really I've started to notice. I taught group fitness for a short bit before the pandemic, and I've been thinking a lot about, I think I've told you this about Peloton and the language that they use. And
Mm,
it's something that once you learn to listen for it, you can't turn that off in your brain, like the specific motivational cues that instructors are using to
yes.
get you to work a little harder.
Yes. Yes. Um, I think there's been a move toward, especially among women, encouraging strength.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there has been this recognition that mental health, is really important and can be benefited um, by a fitness, by fitness. And so, um, yeah, so there has been a shift. I think, we still have a long way to go, but I think that
Mm-hmm.
it's a good start.
Yeah. Um, One thing that, another recurring thread that I thought was kind of fun throughout your book, and I did not mean thread as a pun, but you sort of
Mm.
weave in another pun, the history of like women's workout wear in
Mhm.
your book. And, that's something that I definitely take for granted, my ability to wear a sports bra every
Mm.
single day of my
Mm.
life, because we can't do underwire in a pandemic.
Mm-mm.
But also talking about, the leotards and like the functional outfits that sort of served a dual purpose of showing off what you're working with, and
Mhm.
also just making it functional and comfortable to work out.
Mhm.
So I'd love for you to sort of talk to us about how you wove in like the leotards and all of that fun stuff into the history of fitness as well, because I think it's something that the men reading your book would have taken for granted.
Yeah. Yeah, I that was just one of my favorite sort of threads, as you say, to
I hate
investigate.
myself for
No, you
doing
can see why I had so much fun writing about this. It's like even if I had to cut some of the puns, they're
that.
it's they're there. Yeah, I think there's a fascinating story to be told in looking at the evolution of workout fashion and when various garments came onto the scene. Um, like you said, I mean, the sports bra was game changing, and it was not invented until 1977. Before
Was
then,
that before Catherine Switzer entered the Boston Marathon?
oh, that was 10 years after.
Oh my God. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And Catherine Switzer ran in, I hope she ran in all sorts of sort of creative get-ups. Like she ran in, she has some funny stories about running in, like pantyhose
Mhm,
and tennis skirts and
mhm,
um because Bonnie Pruden was actually a very early advocate for exercise wear,
mhm.
because what existed before was, women often to the extent that they worked out at all, or that it would be in like collared shirts and tailored short shorts, not very comfortable, and clothes that didn't always necessarily just like promote movement or really make you feel very good in your,
Yeah,
in your own
yeah.
skin. Um,
But the sports bra, 19, what'd you say, 77?
1977. Yeah. So
Mhm.
there was this relative status quo. And then by 1977, the women's running boom, largely ushered in by Catherine Switzer, had taken off. And a woman named Lisa Lindahl in Vermont discovered running, loved everything about it, except the fact that it made her chest hurt. And so after a run one day, she was on the phone with her sister and, sort of complaining about this. And her sister said, yeah, they ought to invent a jock strap for women's breasts.
Mhm.
And Lisa was like, no, but really? And she became determined. Her best friend happened to be a seamstress who she recruited to help design the prototype. And then a third woman joined the effort as well. And in the end, the first prototype was created from two sports bras being sewn together. Um,
Amazing.
yeah, it became known as the jog bra, and it grew into the jog bra company, which was a major company until it sold to Playtex. But yeah, so that there was a whole, it's really fascinating. And there's more in this in the book about how they brought it to market. Um, Similarly, lycra, which we now think of as just a staple of workout
Mhm.
clothes, and pretty much all like American clothing in general, was originally invented by DuPont to create a more comfortable girdle.
Mhm.
Girdles were just insanely hellish to wear. Lycra helped a little bit, but they embarked on this decades-long effort. And then basically not long after lycra girdles went on the market, women began ditching their girdles in the name of, liberation. It was liberation through fashion. However, it was then repurposed and became the fiber of workout leotards. Leotards, again, did exist, but they were made from natural fibers and nylon, and they sagged and they just weren't always very flattering.
Mhm.
And so lycra changed all that.
And
Yeah.
now we have like different fabric for the different type of workout you're doing, the different leggings for every different activity. It's
Yes.
wild how many more options we have these days.
Yes.
I thought that was just a really fun little foray in your
Mm.
book as well. We're recording this in February. It's Black History Month. Were there any Black female fitness pioneers that really stood out to you during your research that you maybe didn't know as much about or that don't get as much recognition as what they deserve these days?
Yes. Yes. So the history of fitness and women's fitness, in particular, is very white. Fitness was historically marketed to upper middle class white communities, with disposable income. Um, and so there's a lot to say, and I write about this in the book about just the industry's history of exclusion. But along the way, there were several women of color who um, managed to break into the industry and become these models for other Black women. And I was so fortunate, it was to be able to speak with many of these trailblazers. And so two women that immediately come to mind, one was Janice Darling, who was an instructor at Jane Fonda's original workout studio, and then which was in Beverly Hills, and then opened her own studio in Culver City and had a big following for a while. She's an amazing person. She had endured like a really terrible car accident, and she actually credited her fitness and her muscles with helping her recover and to be resilient. And she said she was the sort of an anomaly for experiencing the success that she did, but she also felt like she didn't have some of the same opportunities that she saw her white peers experiencing. Um, Carla Dunlap, who is still teaching fitness now down in Florida. Well, when I say teaching fitness, she's teaching a bunch of different classes, Pilates, she does pole dancing, she's a trainer. She was the first Black woman to win the Miss Olympia competition. Um, and looking back through old issues of Essence, she was a hero to many Black women. But she also talked about how she would win a competition and the publisher would put the third place finalist, who was white, on the cover because, and he would say like, oh, they're more likely to sell magazines. So there were some really incredible trailblazers who helped to open more doors for women today.
Um, One of the things that, has come up throughout your book too, in terms of, the bar classes and, even jazzercise and aerobics and yoga, is this build towards the boutique fitness moment that I don't know if I can say we're in it now during the pandemic, but definitely before the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
was just a huge, huge momentum shift. I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts about how those trends sort of built up to where we were in the 2010s and, what sort of made that concept sticky among women, especially because by and large, boutique fitness is a female space, I think you would
Yeah,
say.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so boutique fitness, it's interesting to see the sort of the foremothers, in the history of women's fitness. There were uh salons like Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein where women could go, and while they were having a spa day, take posture classes, or kind of what was depicted in, if you saw like in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, an even more
Mm-hmm.
gentle version of that. But it wasn't like we think of group fitness today where, okay, like, however many days a week or whatever you go, you're going to your studio and you're sweating, and it was more sporadic. And um, then there was the rise of aerobics, which was also primarily a female space. And there was Lottie Burke, there was aerobics, and so these were all the predecessors for boutique fitness. It was really, I think based on my research, it was with the rise of yoga that we
Yeah.
saw the evolution to today's boutique studios. Coming out of the 80s, where there had been these big box multiplex gyms and health clubs, which were these, like, in many cities, swinging single scenes, and so hardcore. In the 90s and 2000s, then there was this shift in mentality that working out didn't have to mean going to the gym and pumping iron, or sweating until your leotard was soaked. You could just go to a simple studio with mostly other women, and and experience a kind of refuge where you are working your body, but also, experiencing something more kind of meditative. And I mention that because when you skip ahead a little bit, looking at, like, Soul Cycle has soul in the name. A lot of um, bar chains will kind of encourage that, um, you're stronger than you think you are,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
holistic mentality.
Hmm.
Um, so the idea that you could just go to a small space, and feel part of that the close knit community cultivated there, um, really helped to pave the way for the more contemporary boutique studios. And so many of the popular franchises started in the early aughts, between 2000 and 2010. Um, when you look at their exploding popularity in the 2010s, one thing to think about is, that is when millennials were coming of age and, coming into their own income in some cases. And um, I think I think that the millennial mentality and inclination toward optimization and making, and sort of incorporating work into parts of our life that that didn't used to be considered work, can be seen, can help to explain the rise of especially some of the more intense, workouts.
Mhm. All the hit training studios. Yeah.
Yeah, boot camps,
Yeah.
hit. Yeah. Hmm.
Makes sense. What do you think women are looking for in fitness classes and fitness leaders? Let's not call them influencers, but leaders today. What do you see trending up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant while we're living it to overgeneralize, but I think that I do think a growing number of women are sort of moving toward, or at least interested in moving toward, self-acceptance. The idea that, like we were talking about, that you have to change the way you look to be acceptable, that there's one standard of beauty, is really, I think a growing chorus are kind of calling bullshit on that. And so I know many women who would just, like, walk out or never go back to a class if the instructor was like, better trim those thighs or your, boyfriend's gonna leave you. um, which somebody actually recently told me they had that experience, and it just to the class. It was not to
Oh
anyone in
my
particular.
God.
And they're like, first of all, you're assuming that,
Did I
I'm
have a boyfriend?
straight,
Did
that
I
I have
want
a
a boyfriend?
boyfriend,
Yeah.
that yeah. So, but it is amazing how prevalent that type of language used to be.
Yeah. Well, it's so lazy to default to that type of language these days, I think. Like it's
Yeah,
just
exactly.
you can do a little better.
Yeah, so I think women are looking for an environment that offers them a feeling of allows them to celebrate their body and to appreciate what their body can do, as opposed to how their body looks, and that can help them feel truly strong, um, and that offers a feeling of connection, of being part of a community. I think there's something really powerful about feeling like you're a part of a community of other women too. I think women, I mean, everybody has a lot on their plate right now, but women, in particular, I think are under some particular stressors.
That's a perfect lead into the topic that I was going to close on, which was, the pandemic of it all.
Yeah.
Your book came out the first week of January 2022. I assume it was being edited for quite a long time before that. So like when did you wrap writing your book as we see it now? And if you could add a coda about or an epilogue about the pandemic, and especially, I think you hit the nail on the head with saying women are, taking over a lot of the caretaking duties. They're stuck at home more than ever. I'll leave the rest of the question up to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, my timeline was I sold the book proposal in the fall of 2019, and I spent a few months kind of laying the groundwork. Thankfully got in a couple trips. And then, but I wrote, the first few sentences that are actually in the book in February 2020. So the entire book was written during the pandemic. Well, aside from those like 3 sentences. And
Very important.
yeah. And most of it too was written between the hours of 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. while my
If you have a young son. Yeah.
yeah, he was 18 months really when the pandemic started. And so there was a lot of juggling happening. I was very grateful for the kind of the respite that working on the book offered me. And then I handed in the final draft to be edited, but which was close to what you see in the book in March of 21. So yeah, it was definitely a challenge to try to, on one hand, I was writing about history. However, obviously I was writing about it because it is relevant to the present and what was then the present. And so I was, I felt it was very important to keep up with how things were changing during the pandemic, and they were changing and are still changing so dramatically. There were things in like the final round of copy edits that we did tweak because the world, there was a period when people had taken their masks off to go to the gym. And so it was like, I had to remove the mask thing, and then it was like, wait, the masks are back on. It's a great question about a coda, and maybe for the paperback edition, I'm sure, I would love to add something.
I mean, there's so much you could get into with, virtual fitness, juggling workouts with caretaking and at home equipment, making the third space of the gym, turning that into like your spare bedroom or spare corner of your house. And yeah, I feel like a lot of that disproportionately affected women too.
Yeah, I always think about when I interviewed Judith Lassiter, who was one of the founders of Yoga Journal, and she's this giant figure in restorative yoga, and she has I think about something she told me, which is that women are desperate for refuge, and that idea just really resonated with me. And part of her point was that, if for some women, the gym or their fitness community used to offer that, but as like the ante was upped or as workouts became more intense, it felt more like work. And so it's, you know, um, there's an opportunity there for fitness spaces to offer to offer women refuge. And I say women, of course, this could be applied to anyone, but
Yeah.
as you pointed out, and as you know, there has been a lot of coverage over the past 2 years about the burden of childcare and other things falling disproportionately on women. So I would maybe delve into that idea of refuge, and in a it's very, in either a future book or future writing, I also am very interested in just exploring how to continue to increase access to fitness spaces and continue to change what has historically been true in terms of fitness being a privilege instead of a right.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see what you come up with next. Last question, and it's a softball. What's a workout or workout leader, fitness instructor, whoever, something that you're loving right now that you would recommend our readers check out?
My answer is so sort of generic. I'm laughing because before I heard the end of your question, I was going to say running. I really I really enjoy running.
That's great.
So the hot new trend.
I know. So you're very, very on trend. People will never have heard of it.
Although actually,
first on a Sweat Lives podcast.
Yeah, I know. I would add though, and I think I am part of a trend in this. This is funny. It's even more basic than running. I've developed a new appreciation for walking.
Amazing.
I live in New York City, so it's very easy to get out for a quick walk.
Mhm.
And there used to be on days when I was too busy to run or just didn't feel up to it, I would often just like not leave the apartment, and that didn't feel good either. And so I've tried to be really conscious about trying to get out and breathe some fresh air and do something. And Peloton actually has some great walking workouts. So
Yeah, I love
sort of
those
on
too.
track.
My
Yeah.
sister has done those. She's recovering from an ACL surgery, and she's done Peloton's walking programs because
Yeah.
she can't run. So yeah, no, I'm with you. It may not be groundbreaking, but I do feel like people are having this sense of rediscovery
Yes.
with running or walking, or even if they've written off running for years because they thought it was too hard. You have to do too many miles to be a real runner, air quote. I think the pandemic provided like a lower barrier to entry where it was like, well, I might as well jog a block and then see what happens.
I totally agree. Agree. Yeah.
Danielle, you've been an amazing guest today. Thank you so much for coming on We Got Goals, the podcast. This is your self-promotional moment. Where can we find you on the internet? Where can we find your book?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. This has been so much fun. You can find me on Instagram at Danielle Friedman Writes, where I share a lot of fun retro fitness content.
The graphics
videos.
are so fun. They're so fun.
Thank you. I'm on Twitter at dfriedmanwrites, my website, which has a lot of book-related news and stuff, is danielle-friedman.com. And I have some in-person events, but
the novelty.
I know. But stay tuned for more information on virtual events to come.
And book available wherever books are sold.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on We Got Goals, and we will talk to you soon, Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you so much again.